Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the House versus NCAA settlement and the ramifications of that, but now it's time to talk about the ACC. It's been a little bit on the back burner lately, talking about the House case and everything in between, but the ACC is still battling Florida State and Clemson, and there have been a ton of different things that have happened over the last little bit around this case and around all of the future, really, for the ACC, and we'll break into all of that right now, but I'm curious from your perspective, Tate. All of this stuff is kind of building up towards it. Clemson and Florida State are likely out of the conference. I think we can all pretty much agree on that. The question now, for me at least, is one, what does North Carolina do? Because they feel like the big domino here. They feel like the one that everyone is pointing towards to kind of set this conference off into a landslide of teams leaving instead of possibly just keeping it at Florida State and Clemson. So I'm curious if you see that the same way, and if North Carolina does join this, what do you think the impact would be on the ACC?
Well, okay. First off, I've said this a few times that in my eyes and many other eyes, the heart and soul of the ACC is Duke and North Carolina. That's the heart and soul. Um, and it's a little scary. It's, I think, even more scary when you start looking about the fact that North Carolina has started to show that they're not happy with the financial relationship with the ACC. That's a major concern because the ACC, I feel like they can survive losing Clemson. They can even survive losing Florida State. But when you start looking at North Carolina, NC State, Duke, those type of schools starting to look at what are their opportunities. And I just saw a thing recently where North Carolina is starting to think and about possibly the Big Ten and how they're a great fit with the Big Ten. There was I didn't get the whole article, but there was talk that there is talk within the Big Ten that North Carolina and Miami are better fits for the Big Ten. And you start looking at that and you start wondering what's the future of the ACC. You have Florida State, who has made no bones about it. They want out. Clemson has made it. They want out. And I think I've said this to you. I don't really know. Be careful what you wish for. Clemson and Florida State have been consistently talking about wanting out, but I have yet to hear any word from the SEC saying, "Hey, there's a home for you here." But I have heard Florida not wanting Florida State. I have heard, South Carolina not being keen on a Clemson coming in. That's you could hear literally have a scenario where the biggest, loudest dog on the porch could find themselves in a bad situation. Let's say that they do break up, and let's say NC State, North Carolina, Michigan, Miami, they end up in the Big Ten, and maybe you look at the SEC and say maybe we already have Florida, we already have South Carolina, maybe we want someone else. That's something that hasn't been talked about. Be careful
Yeah,
what you wish for sometimes. Go ahead.
yeah, definitely. It's something that I always thought was interesting when I was breaking down all of this stuff and getting into the ACC. And you haven't really heard from the SEC much on this. And it felt
No.
like when you heard that Texas and Oklahoma wanted out of the Big 12, you almost immediately heard that the SEC was the likely landing spot and that they had kind of set up conversations there to where it was going to be a pretty seamless transition. And I have not heard the same thing about Clemson and Florida State, and I don't know if it's because last time they had to go through this with Texas and Texas A&M, it created some problems in that room, or if it's just they don't feel the need to go after these big time teams. But it does feel like Clemson and Florida State are focused on getting out of the ACC, but not so much focused on where they end up after that, which is a very very
Exactly.
interesting thing that will be really fascinating to watch unfold. But I'm curious, Samantha, that we obviously talk about college football, and no matter where these schools end up, they're going to be totally fine on the college football front because they can charter flights, they can do everything they need to do to make sure that those schedules work. But I'm curious, this affects every single program, every single team in these two schools, and I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you kind of see this impacting not only college football and college basketball and the ones that are going to be more than fine no matter where Clemson and Florida State end up, but how it's going to affect the smaller sports, some women's sports, some sports that don't necessarily have the same ability to charter flights and to do some of the things that football can do.
Yeah, it's definitely about how, the main revenue sports like football and men's basketball overshadow smaller sports at most schools. I'm not saying all schools, but most schools. These sports, like they generate more revenue through public interest, and as a result, the focus on these high stakes financial and decisions tend to prioritize the needs and considerations of revenue sports. So smaller sports are just not really giving much of a voice in this. Also, there's like generally less media coverage and public interest in smaller sports, which unfortunately translates into less influence and representation in critical decisions like this. And I find this a huge issue because the sports that are often in trouble because of this are women's sports. And by not
Mhm.
allowing smaller sports and women's sports the voice they deserve, it does fall into issues with Title IX and also just not a full representation of how everyone thinks because you are excluding a huge portion of athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. I
And I,
think, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was going to ask Samantha a question. Would you be pro having a scenario where, let's say, college football and let's say and college basketball completely breaks away from the NCAA, and the NCAA just covers just the Olympic sports? How do you
Just
feel? Do you think that would be a good thing or a bad thing?
wait, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Just the Olympic sports, you said?
Well, when you think about having, let's say, college basketball break off, college football break off into its own financial entity where they're just about making money, but then the new NCAA falls under all the other sports where Title IX and everything is still in play. Are you pro that, or do you think that would be bad because is the major money comes from college football?
That's such a difficult question because I mean, obviously, like a school would want to make the most profit, and by just excluding that, it would not go well. But at the same time, I think there would be, I guess, more representation of the smaller sports if you kind of split it off. But that is a difficult situation, I'll say.
Interesting. All right.
That's kind of how I see it. It's where I think in a perfect world, I do believe college football, college basketball will be their own thing, and there would still be funding for every other sport under the sun, right? There would still be that ability to cover all those sports, but the reality is football pays for a lot of other sports at most of these universities. So unless there's a ton of shuffling for the pocketbooks and all of the and funders and donors and all of those people come really aggressively for all of these other sports and try to prop them up as much as possible, I think you could run into a lot of financial issues with that. But I'm curious. We're running low a little bit on time here with my um, lame Zoom, but I'm curious. I'm going to talk about it next segment, but I'm curious. Tate, you've talked about this a little bit, and you sent me the article yesterday. Utah thinking about possibly joining the ACC. I don't fully understand why they would want to, but I'm curious, just
Oh,
from your
I do.
perspective. You do? Okay, there you go.
Okay.
Give me
Here's
the.
here's the reason why. First off, Utah, when the whole Pac-12 was collapsing, uh, Utah was one of the very last ones that they weren't leading the charge to leave the Pac-12. The reason why, because the Pac-12 fit the Utah the way Utah's organized because of academics. the Big Ten fits Utah because of academics and sports. Being an NIA school, research dollars. They make a lot of money through research dollars. They're losing money because the Big 12 is not a research dominant organization. So it used to be the Big Two were always the Big Ten and the Pac-12, and they made massive dollars. The next tier under that is the ACC. Okay, when you start looking at this, they went to the Big 12 out of necessity because Colorado and Arizona State, and all those guys who they've been doing a lot of research and things with worked. But when you start looking at some of the schools that are in the Big 12, it just doesn't mesh well with the whole research side of things. And so they came to the Big 12 out of necessity and kind of reluctantly. And they're looking at the overall picture and they're looking at the research programs and how that's going. And they're realizing that it's not a good fit. And it's either the Big Ten is a perfect fit or the next best fit is the ACC. And when you look at what's going on in the ACC with schools planning on possibly leaving, Florida State leaves, where does that put Utah? Utah would be a great fit in there because research dollars wise, they generate a lot of money. They're a premier program. They're gonna be if they're in the ACC, they're gonna be a top program, just like they're going to be a top program in the Big 12. But the research dollars is where the real money is at. And that's the reason why they're very reluctant.
And it shows you kind of where my mind was at because I was thinking purely from a sports lens and not from all the other stuff that goes on in the university. But yeah, no, it's definitely a really interesting thing. And I'm curious, obviously, you go to the ACC because the next best thing from the Big Ten. But 5 years down the road, there could be a world where they say, why don't we just go try to get into the Big Ten? So I'm curious,
Oh,
um, is this the last
absolutely.
Utah move, or are they just going to bounce around until they find themselves in the prize that is the Big Ten?
Utah would jump at any opportunity they can to get into the Big Ten. Um, People haven't done the research, don't realize. Everyone talks about the television dollars, and they look at and they say, "Oh, the Big Ten makes a little bit more than the SEC." No, they don't. When you start mixing the research money, that's the real dollars. That is
Yeah,
the reason why the football games, there's a lot of money being, people come to the games, they use that for a lot of their donors and their research program. But the money is in the research. You look at Stanford. Stanford's $1 billion organization on the research side of things. If you look at the research, no one talks about the Ivy League. Ivy League has no interest in joining any of these conferences because they're making their money in the research world.
yeah, it's definitely an interesting kind of an added thing into this where obviously we like to look at how this will affect the sports at those schools and how all of this stuff will be impacted on that level, but obviously that's not the end all be all in all of these discussions. You want to fit somewhere where the academics make sense, where everything kind of fits with what you want to be. So it'll be fascinating to see what Utah does. We're going to break that down actually in the next segment here, but that'll do it for our guests. Thank you guys so much for joining me again. I apologize again for Friday. Definitely a mistake on my part, but glad we got to get this in and get everyone on here for at least a segment or two.
As long as we have sound, I'm happy.
Oh yeah, we're all good then. No worries. But we'll take our break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Utah and maybe them getting out of the Big 12 and how that will look in the ACC possibly. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.